the aim of today's session is to cover yet another piece of the larger jigsaw puzzle, the material that I've been covering in the talk called Guarding Your Data behind a hard PL SQL API, hard shell, not hard, difficult, hard shell PL SQL API. And it's the bit about installation and so on. And had our dear friend Philip Salvisberg been on the line, I'd have been very vigorous in encouraging him to believe that I don't consider what I'm going to say today to be part of some formal statement of what SmartDB is. Rather, it's just something that seems to me to be proper and sensible, and in one sense, it has wider applicability than just anything who's going to be strict with respect to however we eventually define SmartDB. Basically, the idea is this, though. Let me give this kind of introduction in the context of SmartDB. SmartDB implies many things, and included in our general statement is using the database to its full potential, whatever that might mean in detail. Well, the database has got materialized views as a possibility. It's got advanced queue as a possibility. It's got all kinds of things. It's got Oracle text as a possibility. Certainly, the SmartDB paradigm implies using lots of PL SQL, and presumably there's going to be tables around the place. So the chances are then that you have a large variety of different kinds of Oracle object, and indeed that you have some idea of a classification scheme, and you recognize the general common sense of materializing the classification scheme, not just by a naming convention, where every single artifact that implements the application backend in question is crammed into one schema, but rather that you'll materialize the classification scheme by distributing your objects among schemas, variously named according to your understanding of how you'd like to classify things. So that's the starting point. But I will repeat some point I keep on making. I can't make it too often, it seems. The basic security proposition for runtime behavior, given everything I said about CBAC rules before, is achieved even if you don't care about materializing a classification scheme in any way at all. You could throw every single object that you have that jointly implement your application backend in a single schema, chaotically. Of course, that would bring problems in various areas, but not with respect to the security proposition. Then all you need is your empty connect schema by the side of it, absolutely empty as mentioned, and that schema, the owner of that schema, I should say, will be the target for the execute grants on your API singleton guys in the whole mess in the other schema. And as long as you've done your CBAC rules correct, then full security, full runtime security, full runtime safety is ensured. So to that extent, especially then today's stuff is orthogonal to the basic runtime notions of SmartDB. Next point I'd like to make, it's rather general and abstract again, but I will try hard. Tone and I are very keen on the basic idea of exposing your Oracle database exactly and only through a designed PL SQL API, in other words, a set of subprograms. There are other people who want to express their ideas differently, and they can defend them. But one thing that I particularly like about this informally known as hard shell idea is that every single database call that's made by construction goes through a bit of PL SQL. And by going through a bit of PL SQL, you have a unique possibility to implement what I could perhaps call semantic free side effects. For example, let's assume that you have end users out there who have identified themselves in some way. They're not Oracle database users, they're human beings, and that the identity of them is passed into your program through every API for the normal reasons to support something like a manager can't see his own manager's salary, but he can see the salaries of all his direct reports and that kind of thing. Well, then you might be interested, just as an example, in a bit of ad hoc surveying which people use which subroutines most frequently. Right? That was just a silly example made up, but you can see what I mean. If that idea suddenly struck you, you could implement a bit of code in every one of the smallish number of API subprograms with a bit of ad hoc autonomous transaction logging into some table, and job done. If you had to implement that idea in a different regime, for example, where views were part of the API, you just wouldn't have that hook. Now, one critical, I think, advantage of that hook, and I'll be talking about that in my open world talk, which I'll then take around the world, it's EBR. Let's think about it this way. If you've done this whole SmartDB idea properly, and if you've therefore established this API contract very carefully so that both the UI guys and the database guys are working to it, then the chances are that when bugs occur, they will not affect the API specification. It would be, let's say, a symptom of very chaotic thinking if a bug would be fixed only by changing the API specification. This means then that on both sides, bugs can be fixed without affecting the other side. You know, if there's something wrong in the UI, it can be fixed in that domain without troubling anyone in the database team with what you're doing. And correspondingly, if a bug is found, as bugs are likely to be found in code, in the PL SQL code that implements your notions in the database, well then, you can fix them and leave the UI people blissfully unaware of whatever you had to do. They would just see that some randomly occurring bug no longer occurs at all. Well then, if you're in that regime, how nice would it be to make the database changes without taking any downtime? And that's where EBR comes in. I needn't explain how it works. I assume everyone's heard of it and understands what its purpose is. The interesting thing about EBR is when you've set up your whole new and improved world in a secret space, you need somehow to get end user sessions, I should say client-side sessions, to start using it. And again, if end user sessions are doing ordinary SQL against views, there's no hook. However, if you've got this unique benefit that I just mentioned of an opportunity to put a semantic-free side effect, in other words, a hook, for every single database call, then you can simply, from inside the database, flip sessions whenever you want, from old to new, in mid-flight. I mean by that in mid-end user activity, because after all, the only difference that one will see between the old and the new is a randomly occurring bug that used to occur with a certain finite small probability, no longer occurring at all. So you can do that at any time. So I hope that was enough on that point, just to say that in the context of everything we've been talking about, not all of which is a formal part of the definition of SmartDB, all sorts of things, all sorts of benefits just pour into your hands. And now, onto the topic of this EBR thing, then what you're going to be doing is dedicating one session behind the scenes for the administrator of the patching, using the methods of EBR, to do whatever needs to be done. This requires certain privileges, of course. But the end users are still using the system. And if we're going to faithfully honor the principle of least privilege, and I've been saying all the time that I'm not going to discuss specific consequences of not following it, I'm just going to take it as absolutely axiomatic that you must do anything you do in the regime of the bare minimum privileges that allow it. Well then, any normal application at ordinary runtime in the hands of its OLTP users won't be doing create table, won't be doing alter table, won't be doing create or replace PL SQL. So the privileges that those operations require should not be available. As simple as that. They should just literally not be available. Well then, extending all that discussion further, we just don't want to allow those privileges then to be available in all sessions. We want them to be available only to the sessions who've been authorized to do patching. Now, if you were to examine everything I've said in a kind of lawyerly fashion, you might say that the CBAC role idea is sufficient to guarantee the outcome that I said we should have anyway, without obsessing about what I'm now going to obsess about. And the best way I can describe the philosophy of that is if you just want to protect something valuable in your own house. Let's say it's some jewels you've got and you put them in a safe in your own house. You could, in a sense, then leave the doors and windows wide open every time you go out of the house. But some instinct tells you it's good to have a second line of defense. Well, that's the general kind of thinking I'm doing. So the stage is set now then. The basic point is that I want to now meet the criteria that I just described, which is that at the same time as ordinary end user sessions are running, other sessions can do patching using the privileges that they need. How are we going to do all that? Well, let's just show you that picture because I like that picture. That picture is intended only now to remind you that when one thinks in a typical fashion, a typical orderly fashion, there'll be lots of schemas. That was the point I earlier made, and this is just to remind you in this picture that it's the case in what I've been talking about in previous weeks. Now we'll go on to this, and first of all, I'll just show you the slides that are included in the talk that I've been giving under the title Hard Shell. And it's never really been possible for me to give much attention to these slides. And I'll just talk through them now, and then I'll try to do the best I can to put the flesh on the bones of what these slides say by showing you my prototype implementation of all this lot in a kind of sketchy fashion at least. So for some reason, these little talking heads are covering up my screen. I just have to get them out of the way. That's it, right. So we're now talking about the distinction between maintenance time privileges and runtime privileges, as I just set the stage for. And you need these maintenance time privileges, of course, not least to do the initial installation of your first version of this whole thing in a virgin installation. That's what I mean by the de novo installation. And then you later you need the same privileges for doing patching and indeed upgrading. Now, at this time, I think before I leave this bullet here, it's time for me to do my religious talk about development or developers and the production system or DBAs. I often notice that people are going on about developer versus DBA, the wars, this, that, and the other, and DBAs can lose their jobs, all kinds of things. And I think, forgive me for saying this, that a lot of the discussions in that space are based on maybe something in the real world, but a sad mess up that could be avoided if one were to think about things very carefully. So this is all essential for understanding what's coming. But here we go. I think there's one critical distinction to be made, and that's between the deployed production system and all the other incarnations of nominal clones of that at various states of difference from the currently deployed production system, whose purpose is all kinds of flavors of development and testing. And the distinction is best, I think, categorized or best captured by just making the distinction between the production environment and the development environment. Now, for various reasons, well known, the development environment, though it has nominal clones of the production environment's database, mustn't have certain sensitive data. And given that it doesn't have that sensitive data by well-known methods, then the whole discussions about passwords and DBAs and you name it is different in the development regime than it is in the production regime. And now let's talk about how a whole system comes into being. But here I'm only thinking about the Oracle database backend. I needn't complicate the discussion by talking about the whole stack. In the ideal way of thinking about this, and especially when you're doing SmartDB, then everything that's present in the production database at ordinary deployment time must be there for a reason. It must be there because someone thought it all up and worked out that having all those artifacts was the right way to implement the intended functionality. Well, whose job is that? Is it A, the job of the people who tend to the daily health of the production deployment by making sure that it's backed up, by making sure that there's disaster recovery, by maybe looking at strange performance problems that occur only in the production environment? Is it their responsibility? Or is it the responsibility of the development shop? Obviously, that was a rhetorical question. It's the responsibility of the development shop. So the development shop defines the application backend, and that definition is classically given by a set of installation scripts, all of which you're familiar with in general, and all of which are typically run, though they don't have to be done this way, with the good old warhorse SQL+. And it's the same for the first installation as it is for any later episode of patching and upgrading. And it's the same whether you're patching in downtime or patching EBR style. You're running these scripts through SQL+. Now, where do these scripts come from? They come from the development shop. Of course, they've been typed up and controlled in source control system and QA'd to the nth degree in the development shop. And then they have to be run in the production environment. Who runs them in the production environment? The administrators of the installed system. And there we need to distinguish between those people whose primary function is the ordinary health of the database as an infrastructure, that it's patched, that it has the right critical patch upgrades for securities and all that sort of thing, and those other people whose concern is the application itself in the database, right? So the people who are going to run these scripts need to connect, obviously, and they are going to know passwords in the production system, while nobody in the development shop ever knows or cares about those. And that's the important bit. So there's never going to be the DBA won't let me have another column in my table, so I have to use JSON instead. That just doesn't fit in any proper model of the world. In the proper model of the world, the development shop has the authority to decide everything about the application. And the people in the deployed site have the duty to run the scripts using the passwords that only they know, that achieve the aims that the development shop have written up in their scripts. I hope that's clear. Well then, the people in the deployment shop, of course, have to stand for it all working out all right, so that they're going to make it their business to study everything that they're supposed to run before running it. But it's not up to them to be the gatekeeper of things like alter table, add column. Right then, maybe that's enough of all that lot. So, back to the slides, but you'll see why I said that presently. So this point here then, for normal OLTP apps, maintenance time privileges are not needed at runtime. That just emphasizes the point that in a large number of typical OLTP applications, you're not creating tables on the fly. You're not creating PL SQL on the fly. I know in some cases, people do create PL SQL on the fly daily in response to ordinary end user activity, but that just takes you into a harder regime of doing your security right, and I don't want to get into that now. So then, many architects, in other words, the people who are really designing the whole philosophy of the application backend, don't particularly think much of all this lot. They go as far as having objects distributed among schemas, and they think, well, we'll just have to have, you know, some ad hoc regime where maybe you log on as sysdb, using the, you know, as the role sysdba, end up as sys, and spray things in all schemas willy-nilly, not caring about anything. I don't know. But I don't think that it's safe to do that. I think it's self-evident that that's a careless and wrong way. And these any privileges, in particular, are scary. And the simple thing to say there is that various studies have shown that any human being who knows the password to any Oracle user that has at least one of these any style privileges, and who is obviously nefarious, can find a way, just by Googling around and then doing it, to escalate their privilege regime to full-on DBA. Okay? I'm not going to discuss how that can be the case. I'm just going to take it as a starting point. And the other starting point is that, as we keep on reading in the popular press, a huge number of these various exploits are not done by random hackers on the internet finding a way to tunnel in, but they're done by various forms of disgruntled and or basically dishonest employees who are nominally trusted and who are abusing their trust. So we have to take account of all those things. Right then, moving on, this is my proposal for a safe way to do it. So, and this is going to be hard, I'm sure, to convince some of you, because I've tried to explain this to various people at various times, and they often seem not to get the point. So this is where, Tone especially, listen up, and if I seem to stop making sense, just shout out. So the idea here is that there's going to be a bootstrap. We need a set of users. Of course, at the time the application is first installed, its very, very first installation, there's no speculation going on. The whole thing has been running in the development shop and has been tested, as mentioned, to the nth degree. So the set of users that are needed is known. Similarly, the set of CBAC roles that is needed is known. Just to emphasize a point, there's no formal notion of a CBAC role. You don't create a role as a CBAC role. It becomes a CBAC role when you grant it to a PL SQL unit. Right then, so the regime of users, the regime of CBAC roles, it's known, and therefore I'm proposing that this is the bootstrap. The development shop includes in its whole set of deliverables that will then be processed by human beings whose job is to administrate the deployed system, in this case to install it for the very first time. They'll deliver in particular a bootstrap script who creates all the users and who creates all the CBAC roles, and as we'll later see, creates the other roles, the roles that will be password protected roles that allow DDLs when you need them. And whoever does that can, for all I care, authorize as sysdba to do the job, because you're going to recruit the most trusted person to do this. And if it's a 4-eyes job, a break glass job, fair enough, because it's a one-off bootstrap. So there's no question of security here in the sense of the human beings doing the task, possibly doing things nefarious, because by definition, you've got to trust someone, and these are the most trusted and most highly paid people. So they will study your script, and then they will stand for the outcome that when that regime of users is defined, and when the passwords are published to less trusted human beings whose task is still to administrate in the environment of the production system, those less trusted people will be massively sandboxed. They can only do what they're intended to do, and in particular, they won't be able to do a single thing that affects the fabric of the Oracle database. They will only be able to do the specific application installation, upgrade, patching tasks that they are tasked to do. And that's the second point here. So a strange outcome of that is that there's no particular security discussion around running these scripts, but the security discussion is that the experts must stand for the outcome, that when the bootstrap is done, then safety is guaranteed after that. Now, the next point then is this password protected role. I hinted at that. If you need the privileges to do patching, installation, and so on, only when you need them, and if you don't want them to be constantly available, the way to do that is to grant the privileges in question to a role and then enable the role in the session where you're going to need those privileges. And it's a critical feature of this property of Oracle that when you enable such a role, the result is seen only in the session you're in. And because roles can be password protected, then of course you would. It's just a double step. So there's one step, know the password to log on and do stuff, and another step to enable the role. And if you want, that could be done in a four eyes kind of way. One guy knows the password to sign on, the other guy knows the password to enable the role, and they make sure that they work, by sitting together, not showing each other the passwords, that kind of thing. Right then, so we've done all this lot, and I've mentioned this now. So the result of all this lot then is that no user that's going to own the schemas where the artifacts that implement the application's backend are will have a single explicit privilege. Public is not a privilege, in this discussion it's a role, and there's no getting away from it, and I'm not going to talk about it. But that aside, these users who own artifacts will not have a single explicitly granted privilege, with one exception, and that is the runtime behavior does depend on inserting rows into tables, and that does depend on having a quota. So whatever privilege you want to use, not presumably unlimited table space, but certain privileges on certain table spaces, those privileges must be explicitly granted to the owner who owns the tables, or the owners who own tables. Okay then. And by the way, part of this bootstrap will be granting these roles whose purpose will be to be CBAC roles to the users who will own the code units to which these roles will be granted with so-called delegate operation. That's a subtle variation on the with grant option that you're used to, and it's purpose designed for this use case. Right then, and we've already talked at length about the CBAC role idea last session. So then, this is the basic idea then. And the basic idea is, let's say, characterized by a fair amount of tedium. You can't just have one single script that runs in the production system and that does everything in all schemas. You can't both have the safety and security that you want and that outcome. You have to get different people to run their scripts in sequence in different schemas, knowing their own different passwords. Of course, if you want, you can decide that one human being has all that task, and that one human being can set the passwords for all these things to be the same. But the basic starting point is maximum granularity of control, which does bring a certain element of tedium, but that's the price you pay. And then there's one little bit more too, because at runtime, you don't intend any sessions to be connected to as the owners of the artifacts that implement the application backend. Rather, you intend sessions to be connected only to the owner of these empty connect schemas. Because of that, well, we may as well go for broke and formalize that by making sure that the schemas, I should say that the owners of the schemas that own these implementation objects should not have create session. Now, of course, create session will be needed when someone has to sign on to do the patching or the initial installation. Well then, that just, if we go about it the way I'm proposing, means that you deliberately enter a period of heightened awareness, let's say. It could be like a bank, and when it's taking a delivery, or you see these big armored cars drive up. Under normal circumstance, the security level, the risk level is very low. When one of these armored vehicles drives up and human beings get out and they carry cartloads of coins from vehicle to bank, they're doing it in the maximally safe way, but everyone knows that there's a heightened alert in that period, and they can relax when it's over. So I'm just suggesting a similar kind of thing here. So what I'm suggesting is that we have a special dedicated procedure set up in an appropriate fashion, which I can tell you about in a moment, that gives an extra step. So the human being or team of human beings whose task it is to make DDLs in a particular schema will first connect to a special administrative user for all these different tasks. And then, having used that password, they will enable a password-protected role, which uniquely lets a program that they'll run unlock and grant create session to the owner of the schema where they'll operate. Now, that is not session-specific, that's database-wide. So when you do that, you enter a period of heightened awareness of risk. And of course, when you're done, you reverse it and lock the user and remove create session as well for good measure and get back to the less heightened aware situation. Okay, and in case you don't know it, a password protected role, or a role of any kind, can have two different uses. One is it's just the bearer of privileges, which are reigning when it's enabled. And the other is its state of enablement can be tested programmatically in PL SQL, and you can decide whatever outcome you want on the basis of a role being enabled or not. And that's what I'm doing here. So I think that's basically enough of that. And then this is what it looks like, what I just said. You first connect as this special user whose purpose is to let you go to the next step, and then you enable the role that will let you work in the schema you intend to, here the code schema, and then you run this program to unlock, who will look to see what role is enabled. It'll make sure that only one is enabled, and it'll then unlock that schema in the way I just described. Then you can go in there and now you have to set your password protected role that lets you do the DDLs you want to, and now you can do stuff. So you can see there's 4 passwords involved. Of course, you could not bother with this, or of course you could set them all to the same, but in the limit where you want to be maximally cautious, you could delegate this task to a team of 4 human beings who have to work together to get the result. Okay then. And obviously after patching, you just reverse the step and set it all back to locked, maximum security regime, and now you can relax. And of course, all these things can be audited as well, so that you would be absolutely certain that in time period T, when something untoward was rumored to have happened, you would know, well, during time period T, every single schema that owned artifacts that implement the application backend was locked and create session was removed. So we know that whatever went wrong during that period, it could not be attributed to some ad hoc person doing some ad hoc DDL because they thought it was a good idea at the time. I don't know how often we hear stories about that kind of thing under subsequent forensic investigation. So that's how I would have done it in the talk if I'd only had, half an hour in a 45-minute talk that had to do a dozen other things to talk about it. Now, take two. This is where I'm going to be, daring again and go over to a environment. It's a live environment. I've got some SQL pluses in case I can't remember anything about what they're up to. I'll get rid of them for the time being and bring them up when I need them. And here I am in my favored text editor. For some reason, this ribbon thing on the top of the screen that shows me that I'm sharing and so on refuses to go away. And for that reason, I can't see the menus on my own program, which is a real nuisance. So I'm just going to have to do that. Is that font size big enough to be legible, given that you're all sitting at your own terminals? Tone, you can answer that question.
Yes.
Yes, good. In that case, now I'm going to mention yet another bootstrap that you've never heard about until this moment. And that is that it's often the case that a particular user who will be created by a super trusted human being of the kind who knows the password to a DBA user, in other words, an Oracle database user with a DBA role, but not sysdba, because that's yet more scary. It'll often be the case that such a user needs to create a brand new user who will own PL SQL, who will do some pretty reporting on the $V performance views, for example. Well, static SQL is an elegant and nice way to write such a pretty reporter. And if you're going to compile that static SQL, it's going to make references to these $V guys. And as you know, any role that gives the select on them is insufficient to allow PL SQL compilation. You have to have the privilege explicitly as the owner of the code who's going to own the unit that's got static references to these views. So that means that when you create the user, it's insufficient to grant it select catalog role, or if you wanted to be more fine-grained, select on $V SQL or whatever it might be. Rather, you have to, sorry, I said that wrong. I'll say it again more carefully. Someone who knows the password to a user that's got the DBA role can most certainly create a new user and can grant to that user select catalog role. That's insufficient to let that newly created user own PL SQL with static references to the views that role gives ordinary select access to. And if this human being operating as a DBA style user tried to grant select on sys.v SQL, that would fail, because I don't know why this is the case, but someone in Oracle a long time ago decided that system and other DBAs, the DBA role as well, should not have the select privilege on such $V views with grant option. They've only got the privilege, they haven't got it with grant option. That means there's a constant source of pain there, because you can't keep on ringing up the real big, powerful sysdba every time you want to create a user to do some pretty reporting on $V SQL. So this is my initial big bootstrap. I'm just creating my own special kind of, loosely speaking, DBA, but DBA plus. He's of course got the DBA role and things like that, but I won't show you the code in detail. But what I'm doing is patrolling this, catalog view role, seeing what it gives select to, and for each of the things it gives select to, I'm granting select on that guy to this newly created user with grant option. And it's the same with the shipped PL SQL. My basic rule is I'm going to discover all those PL SQL units, or types for that matter, that have public synonyms, that being the basic notion of the ones that are intended for use somehow. And then I'm going to grant execute on those, again with grant option to this newly created user. And down the bottom, there's an example of one where this using the fact that there's a public synonym isn't a sufficient method to make it work, and that's util recomp. There aren't many things like that, but by all means, they can be handled on a special case basis. So I don't do this every day. I simply run this script. I should say, I would get the sysdba knowing human being in a database that's presently only freshly created and totally empty to run this script, and I would talk it through with that person, and I would convince that person that the user, I've called it here PDB admin, who's created by running this script, then will have, loosely speaking, the ordinary DBA privileges, but more than that, will be able to grant select on any catalog role view. Sorry, you know what I said there, I won't spell it out again. To the user that they are now going to create, and will also be able to set them up to have static references in their PL SQL to all the normal PL SQL things that people can do in anonymous blocks, and that seems to be completely safe. So I hope that wasn't too complicated, but it's something that people are always asking me about, and I don't see why Oracle hasn't done something like this. They have said it, but equally, there's no reason why ordinary people can't do it just as a one-off thing. All it needs is a bit of talking and a bit of convincing. I'm just going to see if anything I do will take this stupid thing off the screen. No. Every time I use Zoom, something about it is different. Hide the video panel, that's not it. It won't go away. Okay then, so what have I got under my hands here? I've got a fair number of files. These files jointly implement my proof of concept for this whole SmartDB hard shell business. And one day, someday, I'm going to publish it all properly. But that publishing requires a properly written white paper, and the first step in all that lot is to go through it all carefully with at least tone and make sure that it all stands for what we're talking about. Meanwhile, I'll talk about it with you. I've got this basic script. It's called Zero, and what it does, right then. So there we are. I'm just running this script. And you've seen this kind of thing under my hands, I'm sure, before, where it just goes through completely mechanically, and it's in 2 steps. I install everything and I run everything. I can do these steps by hand if I like now. I can just install everything. I better clear the screen. Nothing to see, right? That's my whole philosophy. If it works, there's nothing to see. I don't want to see anything like successfully did this, selectively did the other, you know, this user, sorry, this PL SQL thing didn't exist, but now I'm going to create it. I don't want to see anything, just total silence. And then the functionality demo, that's not today's purpose, but I'll just run it through. And again, it does various things, and there are reports of errors and so on, exactly because I was provoking them and I wanted to see those reports of errors. So here's the way I do that, just so you know. I've got, you noticed there was spooling going on, and I've got an ordinary GUI diff thing here, and if I look at my text files, my spool files, you see I've got a reference one for the installation and an actual one for the installation. That's what's on the screen at the moment, and the program deemed that they were identical. Similarly, I've got one for the functionality demo. Okay, so if I just do that, I don't have to read all this every time. I make some tiny little change in the program, nominally improving it. I just press the button, run my script, done in seconds, and as long as these diffs come out showing no difference, I know I'm good. Right then, so what we won't look at them anymore, don't need that. Now we will just look at as much as we can at the detail of this. The functionality demo is not today's topic, but we'll look at this install thing. What does that do? Here it is. Sorry. Install.sql. There it is. So this is what I was talking about. The first thing I'm going to do is the bootstrap that needs, in my example here, the password to this special powerful user that I call PDB admin. First thing is reset. This is just, if you like, my convenience in the development shop for this particular development phase. You wouldn't be doing this in the production environment. All it does is, but I will show it you, is use a utility program I wrote once and for all that's just a permanent part of any of my development databases, and it drops all these various roles, and it drops these other ones. I've separated it out because some of them are for one purpose, some are for the other, and then it drops these users, okay? And the whole point about it is that, oh my God, I hope you can see what I'm seeing, but I can't.
Yes, we can.
Yes. It just is silent. I can run it as many times as I want, and it's silent, okay? I just can't encourage you to adopt this style strongly enough. Now, the next bit of it then, after that, is to create the roles and users. And this is the bootstrap I've been talking about all the time, okay? So the way this would happen in the de novo installation in a production shop would be that the people who know the password to, in this example, the PDB admin super powerful user would study this script. It would be delivered by the development shop. The development shop would promise that it's the proper thing, but nevertheless, the person who's going to run it in production would study it. Here we go. What does it do? It creates the users. Clearly, I've got a bit of mechanization going on here. To the normal do not repeat myself. Some of my users are going to need to have this password protected role. There's a naming convention I adopted to relate the name of the role to the name of the user, and they're just here created with dummy passwords, because this is what you would do in the development shop. When you handed this over, the administrator in production would choose the passwords very carefully and perhaps, run this first and then go in by hand and change them, and another 4-eyes scheme and putting them in safes. I don't care. But the basic idea is that here I'm creating the set of users that I will need to own the various objects. I'm maybe giving them password protected roles if I need it. And I'm granting the privileges that those various roles will need to each role, because that has to be done sometime. That's the part of the bootstrap. So the person who's taking responsibility for all this in the production environment, if they noticed that my script is trying to grant any procedure to anyone, they'd have a panic attack, or at least they wouldn't have a panic attack. They would just simply say, well, you're not doing that. That's against the whole rules. But by the time they've studied this, they will be absolutely certain that the only privileges that are being granted to these new users are benign things like create table, create procedure, and so on. And they're being done with a fair old granularity, so that the guy who owns tables only has create table. The guy who owns procedures only has create procedure, and so on. Okay? And then the roles that are going to be CBAC roles, they are created with no privileges, but they need to be granted to the owners of the code who will need them, and who will later need them when all the stuff is installed, and the delegate thing is lurking around somewhere down in here. I hope that was enough detail of all that lot. So this script isn't that big, and it's 100 lines or so. It's my contention that it's perfectly reasonable to expect the super responsible human beings who administrate the production environment, not the people now, because of the initial bootstrap that I talked about, who would be patching and upgrading the database, but the people who are just concerned about the use of the database for normal purposes, but they don't want to be troubled by every little minute detail of the application's functionality. They just want to stand for the overall security. So they can study 100 lines in a heartbeat, and you can, I'm sure, as the development shop representatives, persuade them that it's okay. So back to the plot then. Sorry, it's the install we're talking about now. What does this look like? I can do the reset any number of times. I just did it, so I don't need to do it again, but I don't see why I shouldn't. I'll just run these things together. Okay, so there's nothing to see. Of course there's nothing to see, it just did it right. And now we're on to installing the code. This is where it gets interesting. And perhaps by the time I've finished this, this particular one, we can come to a stop, because I see that there's not going to be much time for questions this time around. So here we are. What am I going to do? Oh, sorry, this is the other bit of the bootstrap. I won't dwell on this. This is the one who sets up the regimes that I mentioned that allow you to go into one place and then run some code will unlock the schema where you're later going to operate. The only thing to note in this lot is somewhere down here, I'm selecting stuff out of your here, the roles. I'm checking to see which role is enabled. I'm making sure that the only one is enabled and not 0 enabled, putting out appropriate polite messages in each case that it's not one of them, and knowing which role it is. Later on down here, I'm unlocking the thing. So enough of all that lot. Now on to the rest of this install admin code. So we've done that, install the data. Once we've looked at this, all the others follow the pattern, so we're finished. Here we are then. So the first thing we're going to do is do this unlocking and connecting. Where's that one? It's on a thing called unlock and connect, and it's for app data. Here we are. What does it look like? This is what I described. I'm going to connect as this big guy, the first bootstrap guy, I should say, and then I'm going to set that role and then unlock it. So if I unlock it prematurely, I'm told that, you didn't know the right password. I can't do this. If for some reason I set this role, and also another one, administer app code, identified by, if my convention is right. Obviously, in life, you'd have real meaningful passwords. Oh, what did I do? I left out a comma there. Sorry about this fumbling. Now I've got 2 roles. Now I try to unlock. Sorry, you should only have 1, is what I'm hoping it's a. I fumbled that, never mind. I'm going to clear that off in the interest of time. Sorry about that fumbling. Right then, so we'll just do it right now. Except, before we do it right, we'll see what happens if we try to connect to the place we're going to work. It's locked, can't do it. As guaranteed, as I promised you, I should say. So we'll do step 1. Whoa, what did I just do there? I'm having copy and paste trouble here now. I'm suddenly aware that I'm running out of time, therefore I'm getting a little bit edgy. Sorry about that. And this, and then this. Oh dear me. You know what I didn't do? You should have told me about this, Tone. I didn't install that code I've just been talking about. So I'll go through from the start again. Give myself a clean slate. Do that. Okay, that's done. Now back to where I was. This, now I'll just run this thing without showing you any more detail of it. Get over there. And now we're just in this ordinary business where I'm creating the table and doing stuff. You don't have to see any details there. Unique indexes on and on and on, the usual thing. And then when we get to the end there, I'm just setting myself back by locking it up. So I'll just show you that locking stuff now, which is on a directory called lock. and it's for app data. So here we go. I go in again as that user, and I set the role that I need, and I lock up the code, and there we're done. Okay then, so there's only a couple of minutes to the end. Have any questions been coming in, Tone?
Nope.
No, well that's all right then. I feel vindicated, because otherwise we'd have been left in embarrassing silence. Does anyone want to ask a question now? Let me see. Have we still got some people there? Yes, we've got some people there. Any questions there?
Yeah, there's a question now.
Okay, can you read it out? I'll try to find the
Bryn dedicates his attention on the security aspect of SmartDB most of the time, but there's a lot of other aspects which we also really want to hear about. An example, how SmartDB paradigm helps leveraging EBR and things. Maybe a session on this then in the future.
Oh, that's nice. Of course, we were wondering what on earth we might talk about in future sessions. So yes, put it on the list. I mentioned the fact that I'm preparing a talk for Open World on exactly that theme, and I'll be taking it to the normal conferences, and I can doubtless do a version of it in one of these upcoming SmartDB sessions. So that's that, yes. But Philip, though he's not listening, don't think that when I say that here's how you can use EBR to advantage in this regime, that it's part of the definition of SmartDB. Not at all. Right, another question?
Yeah, from the same person, from Dennis.
Yes?
Bryn always says that the connect schema is absolutely empty and only given particular permissions to execute subprograms in other schemas.
I always say that, it's true.
But when it comes to RDS and REST-enabled schema, should it be a different schema to the traditional connect schema? And if yes, why? What security implications dictate this? I think this is a very ORDS specific question.
Yes. The simple short answer to that is I'm not going to be able to tell you anything there with confidence. I can just sort of speak generally to it. But it is, if only I can get the time, part of the ambition that Tone and I have to do a complete soup to nuts demo of this whole thing. Also by recruiting an Oracle Jet guy who will do us a UI as well. And then we'll have the whole soup to nuts thing joined up. But as I understand this ORDS thing, it does require you to create, it will create certain artifacts somewhere that are its various forms of metadata. Now, just how that's done, I'm not sure. But I've got to assume that that would be in its own dedicated schemas, where it has nominally its own dictionary, and that it must be possible that eventually then you connect to an empty schema. If it's not that, then I would say there's something wrong with its design, and if I do discover that to be the case, then I'll take it up with Chris Rice and so on. But I would be very surprised if it had that property. I would be pretty confident to think that it does let you operate in an ordinary empty schema. Yes, so that's as well as I can do on that question. Next question.
Yeah, so we now get a comment on your answer. He was not talking. He was not talking about the metadata schema, but the schema which it REST endpoint, which is the REST endpoint.
Right.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah. So I think it's what you said, Bryn. We will have a full stack example at some point in time.
Yes.
But we're trying to make this while we're also doing other jobs within Oracle.
Exactly.
And at that point, we will surely have REST and RDS set up in a way that we think it should be set up. Let's put it that way.
Yes, something happened to your sound then, Tone. I'll mention, by the way, that ORDS is not the only way to get the result. There's an intrinsic scheme in the Oracle database that lets you convert from something coming in on HTTP to executing a PL SQL program. It used to be known as the XDB listener. but that name is not fashionable any longer, and I think it's going to be revived under a more fashionable name in some relatively soon upcoming release. But that's a side point. We're slightly over time, so I think I should say something now in response to subtext in the previous question. I've always skipped over, elided a bit of detail when I talk about this empty schema. I do think that it's, comfortable. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong word. It makes the explanation so much more straightforward if you just say strictly the schema must be empty. Now, someone might argue that they want to have private synonyms so that they can refer to all the objects of interest without name qualifying them and buying themselves, therefore, some freedom later on from moving things around in schemas behind all that lot. If you want to do that, well, fair enough. It doesn't compromise anything about what I'm saying, because this private synonym is just a one-hop level of direction to what you could have typed explicitly. The other thing is, if you want to do it the other way, not have the application code schema qualify everything to the schema where the API objects happen to be, but again, use just simple names. Instead of private synonyms, you can arrange that a logon trigger just goes alter session set current schema to the place in question, and then all your name resolution will be done without needing to qualify the names. Then, of course, the question arises, who owns that logon trigger, and so on and so on. But having such a logon trigger in your regime could be done as part of the bootstrap. It could be a system-wide trigger who only notices when you're logging onto this particular schema, and so on and so on and so on. So I hope that's clear.
And then there's yet a third option, because Oracle, the database, has so many functionality, and it's this concept called proxy users, connecting via proxy users. But I'm not going to talk about that at all, other than just having mentioned the term. But it all goes to show that the database, having evolved since the early 90s, has such an incredible amount of functionality in it, that whenever you're faced with something that you think, whoa, now I have an issue, now I have a challenge in the database, usually there is a good solution available in the database that has come into existence the past 25, 30 years because of the many developers that have already used the database over that period. So with that, I think close for today, yeah. Bryn, yeah?
I do. We're 4 minutes over time, but I'm thrilled to see that not one of the 12 participants has dropped away. So I will now formally give you all permission to sign off, and thank you for your attendance. Maybe this is the time to say that next month, was the nominal, what is it now, third Tuesday in the next calendar month, is right in the middle of Open World. So with the greatest of humility, I'm asking your permission not to do one of these during that week. So we'll publish when we're going to do the next one at the appropriate time. So thanks for your continuing interest in all this lot, and goodbye for now.
Okay. Bye-bye.